One of my favourite scenes in a Tomb Raider movie, or when you're playing the game, is when you're being swept away down a river, avoiding all the obstacles, and then you realise there's a giant waterfall ahead and you're about to be swept off the edge and plummeted down to your death on the rocks below. Of course, Lara normally manages to catch a branch on the way down. I started with my favourite base, a picture frame, and I used this foam I got from a skip, so it's a builder's foam. You take the aluminium off and you can cut it easily with a box cutter. I built it up in layers. It's quite thin, so I was able to get some horizontal strata in there, and I used the photos a lot to work out what I wanted this rock face to look like. Glued it all together with hot glue, and before you knew it, I had the beginnings of a rock face. I quickly carved off the really sharp edges before smothering it all in sculptor mould to make it a bit smoother. And then I used the sculptor mould to build up a nice circular plunge pool at the bottom. My rock face is a little bit smoother than the sculptor mould finish though, so I used patching plaster polyfiller for that. It's an interior white filler. I put it on roughly, checked the photos, and then used a palette knife to score in the big picture fissures and cracks. I added a dilute coat of artist's acrylic paints so I could basically see what I was up to, and then I started carving. I used a box cutter to carve this to add more fine detail. First up, you can dig the point in and chip out sections if you want. Secondly, you can drag it, like just score it basically, to create finer horizontal strata. This is a sedimentary rock, so it's got loads and loads of fine lines, and the brass brush just clears it all out. I carried on until the whole rock face had loads of extra detail and character. There's some broken up rocks at the bottom on the photos, so I made those out of, it's a dense XPS foam, great for carving, and I just used a box cutter, nothing particularly special, and a brass brush. I used Woodland Scenic's Talus to model the rounder boulders around the edge of the plunge pool. Next up was painting it to look realistic. First up was a coat of the brown over everything to tie it all together. I tried to build up layers of colour variety, and what you can see in the photos is the waterfall, the rock around it is brown. The rock further away from it has more of a grey tint. I used raw umber, diluted again, artist acrylic paints to add some depth and darkness around the areas nearest the waterfall and where it would splash. Then I added some burnt sienna into the mix for a bit of a warmer brown, followed by yellow ochre, just really near the bottom and not much else. I added the grey and weathering streaks at the same time using a big flat brush. The grey looked a little stark, so I mixed in some brown and went over it, and then to get even finer detail I broke out a very small weathering brush. It's got a serrated tip, so it's brilliant for streaks. And then to bring out all the little details I used a white spirit and oil paint wash. This is Starship Filth by Abteilung 502. It's a great colour, it's just a dark grey, there's no starship element to it really. And what it will do is it will sit in the cracks and darken them, adding some false shadows, but it will also sit on the surface, and because there's a lot of texture with the plaster, it will make it look so much better. I added in some dark and brighter greens towards the bottom where you might get more stagnant, mossy type rocks. And that was the rock face finished. At the bottom is an epoxy resin plunge pool, and to keep it inside the diorama I added 2 acrylic dams using UV resin to secure them in place. Before the resin goes in though, I need to add the sandy beach. And if you've seen my Pirates of the Caribbean diorama, you'll recognise the sandy beach I'm using. It's beige tar grout and sand, about 1/3 sand. Once it's all cleaned up and tidy, it's time to glue it. A quick fine spray of isopropyl alcohol, diluted about 1/3 isopropyl alcohol to 2/3 water, will help break the surface tension, and then I follow it up with my matte Mod Podge and water mix, 1/6 matte Mod Podge, 5/6 water. The reason I have it so dilute is I can't get anything more than that through these fine spray bottles. But when it dried, it was just too dark. Didn't have the right colour. I could have added some white tar grout in with the beige and redone another layer, Instead, I decided to paint it. This is natural or buff titanium. They're both the same colour, dilute artist acrylic paint, and I just used it to colour the central sections where the river and plunge pool are a lighter sand colour. Next up, the waterfall. Now I decided to use polyfibre for this. I've used it for dust in the past, but more recently I used it in my Halo Mongoose water splash diorama as water splashing, and it was brilliant. So I thought, I wonder what it'll be like as a waterfall. And the answer is excellent, but messy. The key ingredient is the UV resin. You pour it on top, squish it around, and then set it with a UV torch. You do need to be wearing gloves for this, and I changed mine many times. But it's easy to tease out thin streaks which look just like frothy water. And I was really pleased with the effect I got at the end of this. You can even use it to make the splashes at the bottom. It didn't seem very solid though, so I went on and added a lot more of the UV resin, let it soak in, and then I wish I'd stopped there. Just zapped it with the torch. But I didn't. I thought, I know what I used on that mongoose water splash diorama. I used woodland scenic snow. I'll add some of that on. And the reason I'm not sure about it is you can really see the fibres much more because the woodland scenic snow sticks to them. Before they were wispy, now they're a lot more solid and fibrous. Anyway, let me know what you think looks best. Is it pre or post snow? So onto the water. I'm using epoxyplast resin. It's a deep pour crystal clear resin, and it does what it says in the tin. There's no bubbles. It's really good. The only downside is it does take 72 hours. I coloured it with some Green Stuff World blue and green tints, and I did a first pour of a darker coloured resin and let that set, and then I did the full pour with a lighter coloured resin. And the reason I wanted lighter was the dark colour was to create depth, the lighter colour is more the colour that the river and stream areas are, and that the edges around the beach sort of section are as well. 3 days later, I took the dams off and repainted the edges so they look nice and neat. To add ripples, I used gloss Mod Podge. It dries relatively flat, you can put it on with a brush, but it gives so much life to the pond. When it was all dry, I used white paint to add the final froth. But it wouldn't be a jungle waterfall without Lara Croft hanging from a branch. Now, you can't get Lara Croft models hanging from branches, they're just not out there. So this is a game asset that someone's taken out of one of the games. I made her so she'd 3D print, and then I rigged her so that she would hang onto a branch. That wasn't quick, believe me. Finally, I printed her on my Elegoo Mars, and now all I need to do is paint her. I used Vallejo acrylic paints, added a few key highlights, and then added a wash across everything. I found a twig in the garden she could hang on to and just super glued her in place. Now the waterfall itself at this point is almost scaleless, but Lara is 1:35, and I was dreading having to do loads of jungle vegetation. And then Fabio from Diorama Precipe got in touch and said, would you like a box of vegetation? I was like, it's a sign, the jungle is happening. It was actually an embarrassingly large box, but it did have a variety of different types of vegetation, from laser cut big leaves through to natural materials that have been cured and dyed. You'll see I've got green thumbs in some of the photos. Most of them seem to be mosses or clumps of real plants that I broke apart into smaller pieces so I could do some fine detail. One of my favourites were these. They're fern fronds that you break off all the individual sort of frond elements and make into more palm-like structures or small ferns. Brilliant and very quick and easy to do. I might use this for a palm tree in future. When building up small plants like this though, I do recommend using super glue and a zapper. The zapper will fix it straight away in the final position. I was blown away by how much variety there is. So go check out Fabio's shop, Diorama Precipe, links down below in the description, and I'll have a card thingy as well. Go check it out, it's worth looking at. There's so much variety, you will find something for your project in there, I guarantee it. And before I knew it, I was done. So don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button. And if you want to support me further, there's a Patreon or YouTube channel membership. You'll get more videos and behind the scenes. Otherwise, see you next time.